You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 12th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio.
It's 1 a.m. in Beijing, 2000 in Amman, 1800 here in London and 10 a.m. in Seattle. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. The UN condemns Israel's carelessness, not for the first time. The UK's newish Prime Minister looks for his marks on the world stage. And would you pay $200 million to spend a few minutes adrift in a remote, lifeless vacuum when a fraction of that will get you a whole weekend in Adelaide? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Mari Leconte and Vincent McAvaney will discuss the day's big stories, and our weekly letter from is a letter from Crete. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I'm joined today by Mari Leconte, political journalist and author, and by Vincent McAvaney, journalist and Monocle Radio regular politics commentator. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Mari, we should probably start by doing that incredibly vexing thing which we as a species keep doing, of saying all the stuff about somebody that we should probably have said while they were still with us, and now they're not.
Yes, my former partner and close friend David Knowles passed away over the weekend unexpectedly. So listeners may have heard of him because he was hosting the Ukraine Daily podcast for the Daily Telegraph. Mm-hmm. So kind of like chronicling every single day, obviously, the war in Ukraine, what was going on there. So he did several trips as well, like reporting trips in Ukraine to kind of speak to people. And I think the point of the podcast was very much to kind of centre Ukrainian voices, Ukrainian lives. I think in a way that few other places managed to do. And he's someone who didn't even really have a background in kind of like conflict journalism or podcasting, for what it's worth. But managed to clearly create this thing that was really beautiful. And I think, created this really strong voice, I suppose for Ukraine. And it's incredibly sad. It's 32 is no age to die. And
it's not even close.
It's not. And he was also, even aside from professional stuff, just a really, really great human being. So there are no silver linings to this, really.
None whatsoever. And it's not to suggest that it is one, but obviously the podcast still exists and is very much recommended, and I think will have extraordinary ongoing value as a day-by-day chronicle of, it's that whole first draft of history thing. But as someone who knew him on air and off, was he one of those people for whom you put him behind the microphone and that's just who he was?
So amazingly, it turned out that yes, because actually when the war started, he was the head of social media at the Telegraph, so had nothing to do, politely with, kind of radio or anything. And just, I believe it actually started as a Twitter Spaces. He thought something should be done about the war and clearly sort of found a talent for that. But it's quite funny because he had sort of every other talent as well. So he played the mandolin and the viola, spoke so many languages, including ancient Hebrew for some reason. He was not Jewish. It was just a general interest that he had. Also could read hieroglyphs. Again, not entirely clear why. Again, had sort of every interest. Apparently took up Warhammer recently and had a cricket team that played in Croatia and Iceland. He just had every interest a person can have, and somehow was quite good at most of them, which would have been irritating. The fact that it wasn't really shows.
I was on the verge of saying exactly that, to be honest.
That it was not shows what a great person he was.
No, it is an absolutely dreadful shame, and I think the very least people can do is take in a few episodes, perhaps even plucked at random from, there's now quite an archive of the Ukraine Today podcast. We will be not starting with Ukraine. We will instead be starting with the Middle East, where it has been confirmed that among the 18 reported killed yesterday by an Israeli airstrike on a school building in Gaza were 6 employees of the UN agency responsible for Palestinian refugees. UN Secretary-General António Guterres was forthright by way of response, describing the general situation in Gaza as totally unacceptable and characterising Israel's actions as, quote, dramatic violations of international humanitarian law. It is not the first time Israel has struck the Al-Jaouni school in the Nusrat refugee camp. Now, as previously, Israel claims that it is performing parallel duty as a Hamas headquarters. Vincent, does this strike you as anything new from Guterres? I mean, these are not the first UN workers, very far from, in fact, the first UN workers who've died in the last 11 months or so in Gaza.
No, sadly not. And other aid workers thinking as well about the World Central Kitchen workers who were killed as well. This is sadly becoming all too common. I think the only thing that potentially will stand it out is that you're about to kick off with the UN General Assembly. Much could be made at that meeting to try to focus minds, the fact that the UN itself is losing staff in this conflict. And we'll see, just how far Guterres goes in his lobbying efforts with all those world leaders gathered in New York to try and get them to put more pressure on both sides to accept a ceasefire.
Murray, I guess the contours of the argument that follow every development in this conflict are by now fairly well understood, and we have once again heard from Israeli sources that this is the sort of thing that will keep happening if Hamas continues to insist on operating out of or adjacent to schools or hospitals, which is something Hamas do assuredly do, but is that really, does that place the burden of culpability on Hamas or upon the people who launched the missiles?
That's a tough question, isn't it? And I agree, as you know, it has been proved that Hamas, it is something that they do. But also, and it's going to sound incredibly glib, but, as it stands at the moment, Palestinians in Gaza live in such close quarters, in such small areas. So actually, even if, let's say, Hamas were to say, we're going to move out entirely of places where any civilians could be, I'm not sure that could be geographically possible.
It's really
everyone
not.
is kind of squished together anyway. So I do think, it's reasonably fair to make the point saying, we're just trying to target Hamas. But again, it's kind of missing, I think, quite a big part of the picture because it's still, not recognising the fact that there's not really anywhere else they could be going anyway.
Conversely, Vincent, the Israeli Defence Forces are also claiming the elimination of another Hezbollah military commander in a targeted strike. This is Qassem al-Shaya. Does that perhaps suggest that, they're not operating in Gaza with the kind of subtlety they could be, given that they have demonstrated more than once that they can hit a single building with a single individual in it in Lebanon?
I don't think anything is happening by accident in Gaza. This is a military force that is incredibly well equipped, which manages to buy, through licenses, some of the most impressive weaponry and the most targeted weaponry in the world. And just to add to the point that Marie was just making, Gaza was a tightly confined space before the war. Add to that one of the heaviest bombardments the world has ever seen, if not the heaviest. We're talking kind of Germany in World War II levels here, bombardments. There are so few places to go, so many buildings destroyed, and the constant, direction from Israel that people need to move here, there, and everywhere, that it's unsurprising now that you are just seeing a real lack of anywhere that could be marked out for the leadership to go, and they have willingly implanted themselves in the population. But it is at the point now where you're saying there is literally nowhere for them to go. And in terms of strategic targeting, I think Israel is trying to do both. It is trying to target, but also it's clear now just to try and bring into this population some kind of historic memory to never attempt anything like this again, because the repercussions will be so severe.
We are coming up for the anniversary of this, the anniversary of October 7th, that is, Mari, which will focus renewed attention on where this is going, but it will also focus renewed attention on the stances of Israel's allies. And if we think of what we've heard here in the UK from the relatively new government, i.e. most notably this suspension announced by Foreign Secretary David Lammy of, I think, 30 out of 350 licences for the small number of UK material and weapons used by Israel. Do you think we're starting to see something generally shift among Israel's allies, the UK and the United States in particular?
Yes, I think so. So I think David Lammy is still trying to walk quite a fine line, I think, because obviously they did want to take a harsher kind of stance against Israel since they became the government in July, but at the same time do not want to alienate anyone, etc. And I think that applies to everything the British government is doing at the moment. They do not want to be rash in kind of anything or radical in anything, but you can still see a kind of a sense that the line is changing. And I think in the US as well, you can sort of see that Biden clearly has has this sense now of he knows he's not going to run again. There's the legacy obsession, and you can sort of tell again at the moment, mostly in smaller things, that he is quite desperate to, if not sort everything out before he leaves office, then at the very least be able to say, you know what, I actually gave it my best shot and I kind of managed to move the situation on to an extent. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some movement from the allies of Israel before the end of the year. But I think the big question is, would that actually change anything at this stage? I'm not convinced it will.
I think the other thing, just on the US side, we know that sort of senior members of the Labour Party, including Jonathan Ashworth, who is now the leader of a movement called Labour Together, which is a think tank. He was meant to be in Sir Keir Starmer's government right now. He was in the shadow cabinet here, but he lost his seat unexpectedly on a Gaza protest vote. And we have several MPs in the parliament here who were just elected on that ticket in areas with big Muslim populations. And as we understand it, the Labour Party have been giving strong warnings to the Democrats that this could happen to you as well. Don't take for granted the seats that you've got. The Muslim vote that in this country has particularly supported Labour in the past, and in the US, the Democrats as well. Well, if you ignore this issue for too long, it might have repercussions for you.
Well, we will move on somewhat, and as has been much remarked upon, 2024 is almost certainly the greatest single-year democratic festival ever conducted. Around 2 billion people in more than 60 countries, a number obviously inflated by the coincidence of US, Indian, UK and European Parliament elections, have been eligible to decide whether to keep the current mob in charge or let some other bunch have a lash at it. As a consequence of this, a certain reshuffling has occurred of the personnel sitting next to the flags at various international fora. Murray, you are somebody who has written extensively about, I guess, the human and character aspect of politics. Where did you get to on whether it actually makes a difference who is in charge, or perhaps how big a difference a leader can make, a new leader, especially early in their stint?
Oh, do you mean on the kind of international stage or domestically? International, that's an interesting question. I think it sort of depends on the person, which is the very, useless answer I can give you. Because, for example, France has a shiny new prime minister. It's Michel Barnier. Oh, my God, who is he? No, hang on. We know
shiny and new is doing some lifting there.
Exactly. That is someone who's been on the scene for a very long time, who's known, and, to an extent, definitely trusted in the EU. So I think, again, if the reshuffle involves just shuffling in, old faces again, I'm not convinced a lot changes. Then it depends. I think looking at Britain and the EU, I suspect that some things will change, because one of the big problems before that, when the Conservative Party was in government here in Britain, was that the EU just did not trust really a word that was coming out of their mouths by the end, either because they felt the PMs were kind of like lying, or the press would kind of brief everything and mess everything up, or even the Conservative benches. I think even when Theresa May was trying quite hard, they knew in Brussels that that there was very little she could actually get through her own benches. So I think even basic stuff like goodwill and new blood can really change everything on the kind of that international stage. But weirdly, I think that matters most in the first few months, but whether that actually really meaningfully changes the kind of texture of relationships between countries on the long term, I'm not so sure. I think it's just that there's a wave of optimism at the beginning, but then quite often I think entropy kind of wins out.
I mean, as a test case, Vincent, we have seen an amount of Sir Keir Starmer bestriding the world stage since he was elected in July. Do you get the sense that anything is really, well, if not tangibly different yet, then looking like it might be at some point?
I think there are signs, and I think particularly Sir Keir Starmer's visit to Ireland recently, the Anglo-Irish relationship has been a tumultuous one. And if you go back to, I think, around sort of 2010, 2011, when the Queen made her state visit to Ireland, that was seen as a hugely significant moment. She, was in a country which had been torn apart by the Troubles and the royal family and the British monarchy and British influences. Real at the core of that is part of Protestant identity, unionist identity. And she did a remarkable trip of the Republic of Ireland in which she even gave an address starting in Gaelic. And, as someone who has Irish family, they were slightly taken aback by how gracefully and diplomatically she handled all of that. And so you have this sort of move away a generation after the Troubles somewhat, and you think that's all in the past. And then lo and behold comes Brexit, tears it all up again, raises all the old scars, opens them up, and you see sort of a rise of some political violence in recent years, but also just a fundamental lack in the UK government of understanding by the Conservatives of the issues. You had a Northern Irish secretary who not only didn't know this, but admitted that she didn't know, the difference between Republicans and Unionists. And this is, a 50-something-year-old woman who grew up through the Troubles, not just a woman on the street. She was an MP and then in the cabinet and did not know. I mean, it was remarkable. And I think it went down so badly in Ireland that really anything at this point would be better on this relationship. And we've seen Keir Starmer making overtures to try and mend some fences here.
I wanted to come in briefly to give you the exact quote, which is etched in my mind, which was, I didn't realise that people in Northern Ireland voted along sectarian lines. Which is just beautiful, I think. But anyway, sorry, do go on.
Imagine being an adult in Britain and not knowing that. Part of it is he's got the experience. He worked in Northern Ireland with the police force there, which has been part of the legacy of the Good Friday Agreement. One of Labour's greatest achievements in government in 1998 under Tony Blair. And then you had the likes of Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, who I believe admitted that he'd never even read the Good Friday Agreement. And I think it just did a lot to sort of poison the well of good, brotherly feeling between the two nations that had come in the sort of early 2000s and through the Cameron years, and then it really took everything back. So I think on that front, in Keir Starmer, which is effectively, the sort of back garden area, it's done something so far because, let's be honest, London got outplayed by Dublin regularly during the Brexit years. And Dublin was very effective in lobbying, not just the rest of Europe, but also the US, and particularly Joe Biden. Joe Biden made it very clear he wanted nothing to do with Liz Truss, openly criticised her, and in part that was due to the issue of Ireland.
Murray, there are those national leaders, and I think if you think in recent times, you probably think most obviously of Tony Blair and Emmanuel Macron, who clearly do have this idea that the force of their own personality can change the world, possibly even irrespective of the office they actually hold. Does it strike you that Starmer is one of those people, or may turn into one?
I'm not convinced that he will. So I think a thing I come back to often is I was speaking to a friend of mine just before the election who works in the media and who's essentially a Cameroon's kind of centre-right sort of British person. And he said, I'm just quite depressed that Keir Starmer is going to win the election because he's the first Prime Minister we're going to have, we'll have had in a long time, perhaps ever, who just recognises that Britain is a kind of unimportant medium-sized nation just off the coast of Europe. Which I really enjoyed. I thought that was actually very astute because prime ministers quite often have this grand idea. Either Boris Johnson being an extreme example, but they all have this outside idea.
Everything's world beating.
No, exactly. Yeah. And as a result, and I think they kind of have that view of like themselves to an extent as well and stuff. Whereas Keir Starmer is just, if anything, a bit too realistic. You want to be like, come on, aim higher, buddy. Like you can do it.
You don't get the sense, again, in contrast to Boris Johnson, that Starmer has ever given the "we will fight them on the beaches" address to his bathroom mirror.
No, but I do think there is one or two scenarios that could play out, because you've got to remember as well, when Blair came in, it's when Clinton hit trouble because of the Lewinsky scandal, and he sort of did this, with Kosovo and everything else. He kind of, a couple of things happened that he took the reins on and sort of led the way on, which made him this global superstar. If Keir Starmer ends up with a Donald Trump presidency in November, then he sort of plays the role that perhaps Merkel played under the first Trump presidency, which is the kind of adult in the room at G7 meetings, trying to corral everyone else, trying to sort of be that voice of Western diplomacy and liberal values. Or if Kamala Harris comes in, it's maybe not as high profile. It would have been interesting had Joe Biden given a good debate performance 2 months ago and managed to win the presidency again, but then we would see, obviously, throughout a term, a real decline, how much Keir Starmer would have stepped up then as well. But I think his path as a Prime Minister is very much going to be dependent on what happens in the US election in 8 weeks' time.
Now, Murray, there has here been a lot of ink slung, to use the old school terminology, about the appointment of Michel Barnier as Prime Minister of France. And I think it's possible that he's better known in some sectors of the United Kingdom than he is in quite a lot of sectors of France, because to a certain sector of Britain, he is he's the bad guy of Brexit. Is it fanciful to suggest that appointment actually means anything in particular for UK-France relations?
I'm not convinced it's going to meaningfully change anything. I think the only thing it's going to change is, and that's not really about him, but just about the makeup of the National Assembly, is that, and it's a different discussion whether, people think Macron made the right decision by appointing him or not. I will not be showing my view in any way. But the point is, essentially, Macron looked at the National Assembly and saw that, more or less, there were kind of like three massive blocks of the kind of, united left, the centre and the far right. And he said, well, you can't agree on what you want, want, so I'm just going to give no one what they want, and I'm just going to give you a right-wing, Prime Minister who is from a faction which is really, really minor in the National Assembly. So I suspect that Barnier will be quite busy enough with the National Assembly and trying to run somehow France to actually care much about Britain, I'm sorry to say.
Well, let's look now at the United States. And recent years have not, to understate the case, wildly been a golden age for Boeing. Things may, even as we sit here, be getting even worse for the aircraft manufacturer. As of this writing, 33,000 Boeing assembly workers were voting on whether to accept a pay offer worth 25% over 4 years or strike. And here I pause for the producers to yell any updates into my headphones. No, apparently not. Anyway, a 2/3 majority is or was required, depending on what happened, or is happening, or will happen, for tools to be downed, and the assembly lines would cease proceeding as soon as Friday. I did want to start by establishing the level of militancy here in the room. Have either of you ever stood on a picket line?
Obviously, I'm French.
Sorry, I now realise what an intensely stupid question that was.
It's actually offensive. I will be walking out, actually. I am on strike now.
Exactly. Were you aware at the time of what the picket line was for or against, or was it just like, whatever, I'm in?
As a student, I definitely used to help blockade my high school without quite knowing. So you'd get there to arrange the blockade and then be like, by the way, what are we doing? Like, what is this for? I wish I were lying in any way, but I'm really not.
I've spent enough time in France to be absolutely convinced that you're not. Vincent, have you?
I've covered plenty, and I, as a freelancer, have refused to cross the picket line to work when, say, at certain broadcast institutions there is a picket, and I've said, well, I'm not going to walk through that to go and do a shift. Thanks very much. But I've not been on one myself.
I have not only stood on a picket line, I was standing next to Tony Benn.
Wow.
That felt like a bit of a sort of welcome to Britain moment. Yeah. a bit like getting tear gassed in Paris. It's just like, it's one of those things. If you spend enough time here, that'll happen and you'll feel like you've joined the club. But we wanted to broaden this out, and I'll ask you first, Mari, given your, well, if not necessarily wide experience, then just given your Frenchness, whether you perceive a certain worldwide rise in sort of workers' activism, because there's strikes by IG Metall and others in Germany, Samsung in India, Air Canada. These are all actual or threatened things. Are we getting more of this than maybe we did 10 years ago?
I think so, and I'm not entirely sure why that's the case, but I have a few theories.
Go on.
So the first one, I think, is just the pandemic. I think the lockdowns, well, the pandemic in general, really fundamentally changed both the world, but also the way people engage with the world and their kind of expectations from their work, from their life, etc. So I do think that, this is something, and obviously we're not really talking about it anymore, but that's kind of really, shifted the way people think about everything. And I could see them going, actually, no, like, we can ask for more, especially in the context of a kind of cost of living crisis across large parts of the world, of saying, especially people who were not furloughed, didn't have, could not just stay at home, I think, during the actual pandemic, going, we had to expose ourselves to this deadly virus day after day for no obvious reason.
Very difficult to build a 777 at home.
I feel like that'd be quite a fun experiment. And I think the second thing as well is the internet. It's just the fact that the world is actually a lot more connected than ever before, which actually you can sort of link that, I think, to the pandemic, in that a lot of, even the people who were not very online, I think, during the pandemic sort of had no choice, but ended up spending a lot of time on social media and the internet during the lockdowns or when there was nothing to do. And there's that sense, I think, that kind of seeing what people are doing, and that's why you see that in, kind of even strikes of tens or like hundreds of years ago, one starts and then suddenly it's quite contagious. And I think that you can now see that on the global stage, where you'll see saying, okay, well, hang on, my working conditions are appalling, but the factory down the road, or the factory, 3 cities over, is having a strike because of exactly the same thing. Why shouldn't we, etc. So I do think that, striking begets more striking, and that's probably... the internet has probably changed that dynamic a bit.
In the context of the United States, Vincent, is this also the inevitable product of what is, frankly, certainly compared to Europe, a booming economy? If any of us, and I'm sure we have had recent conversations with friends who work in or have been to America and perceived certain disparities in between what people are getting paid there, what people are getting paid here, and ground our teeth accordingly. But in a booming economy, these workers are able to say, well, if you don't give us more, somebody else will.
Yeah, and I think, one thing that has also happened in the pandemic is inequality in wealth and income inequality has massively been exposed, and that's something that people aren't willing to put up with anymore. And particularly, I don't think, we're talking about online and being more connected, we also got to see more of the lives of the 1% and the sort of C-seat class. And I think, even in sort of, and that's now, you can see that in how much drama, The Perfect Couple this week on Netflix and the White Lotus franchises and all that kind of stuff. We're very interested in that sector of society at the moment. And I know we're going to talk about one of them blasting off into space. And I think we're all a little bit fed up with, being told, oh, we've got to, generate these huge profits for companies, but we can't have anything above an inflation pay rise this year. And then lo and behold, if you're an Amazon worker and you're having to pee in a bottle in a factory and you're being tracked by every step, your boss and his girlfriend blast into space. I think maybe time's up on accepting that. And I think that is a message that, we are seeing is resonating. I think part of Labour's message subtly in the election, and I think part of Joe Biden's message, and now Kamala Harris's, was it's time for corporations to pay more. A lot of them are being badly run. A lot of them are simply, burdening debt on the companies, extracting profits for shareholders, and leaving the workers completely annoyed. And there's been too much of a disconnect between workers and employees in companies and the effective management of those companies, because they're in a different stratosphere, quite literally sometimes in a different stratosphere above us.
Well, as Vincent has cunningly foreshadowed there, about 700 kilometres above us earlier today, American billionaire Jared Isaacman became the first privateer astronaut to walk in space, spending about 30 minutes outside the Resilient spacecraft as it orbited at circa 30,000 kilometres an hour. Isaacman and 3 others blasted off from Kennedy Space Center aboard a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket on Tuesday, and if all goes according to plan, will be back this weekend. Isaacman bought the mission, known as Polaris Dawn, from SpaceX for an amount generally reckoned in the vicinity of $200 million. Murray, where would you put your level of agogness at this feat?
It's a weird one, I think I'm equal parts just really annoyed by it. But in the sense, as we were literally talking about earlier, and as Vincent would put really eloquently, this idea that so many, the world is so unequal, so many people don't have enough money, and also even governments, national governments, just don't have enough money to do even half the stuff they want to do. And you just get some prick being like, space. It's just so annoying. But I'm going to be honest, the other half is like, that is actually really cool, and I'm very jealous. So,
you have summed up my feelings on the subject entirely. As regular listeners to Monocle Radio will be aware that it's always a treat. And I'm aware of, even as I say it, how incredibly fortunate it is to be able to say it is always a treat to interview astronauts, of whom I have interviewed several, and it just never gets old.
One of my favourite, I interviewed Commander Chris Hadfield, and he was on the space station. He was the guy that kind of revolutionised modern space travel, because he just fully engaged with social media. He shot a music video in space. He really renewed interest at a time where NASA was slightly flagging. And just the way that he approached answers, the way that he thought, it was absolutely fascinating. I would always recommend interviewing an astronaut.
We have had Commander Hadfield on Monocle 24 a few times. Monocle Radio. It was Monocle 24 at the time. That's why I said on Monocle Radio a few times. I mean, and I'm, Murray, long past, I think, getting meaningfully starstruck, but about 5 years ago, I think, when we interviewed Charlie Duke, 10th man on the moon, it was trying to keep that thing in your head. I don't know if you've ever had this in an interview of just thinking, think of a question to ask him. Don't just say, "You're Charlie Duke." But I suspect I know your answer to this question, given what you were just saying. But if you had, and I don't know that you don't, but if you had $200 million just sort of lying around, would you do this with it?
So I've been thinking about this, actually. I was thinking about it earlier today. And my conclusion is that going into space for fun is exactly like drinking a shot over the age of 30, in that you're only going to know if it was a good idea once you've done it. It might have been the worst idea you've ever had, but you will not know until you know. So I feel like, again, 50-50 on whether I get up to space and I'm like, this is literally the best moment of my life, or I go, oh God, oh no, because I'm quite an anxious person. And no way of knowing.
If you're quite an anxious person, a sort of space capsule may not be the best place for you.
But also, there are currently people stuck in space. We're meant to go for not long and are now there for very long. So I think it's not, unreasonable for me to be quite stressed about it.
Yeah, you've got to hope they took a Scrabble set. Vincent, I realise that, it's an academic consideration for those of us who do journalism for a living. I mean, $200 million, I have barely half that, for example. But if you had $200 million, would you spend it going into space?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I kind of think
honestly,
I would.
Absolutely. Unequivocal about it. If I had it, I would do it. And I don't begrudge them. I just wish that they'd pay. There was a quote here where he said, in space, Jared Isaacman, this billionaire, this sure looks like a perfect world. Well, it does if you don't look under the surface. And as we've been talking about the income inequality and particularly billionaires, their vast carbon footprints and how much damage they're doing. So hopefully he comes back and is sort of a little bit struck. And it was really interesting. William Shatner, when he went up with Jeff Bezos of Amazon, came back and he said what fascinated him was that when he looked out and he said, the Earth looked beautiful, but I just realised how alone we were and how rare what we have is and how we're not prizing it. And he's come back and said he's more interested about what's going on Earth than in space, because it really shook him seeing the vastness of it. And you kind of hope if these billionaires are blasting off that they do take a little bit more interest in what's going on, because you can very clearly see from face the impacts that we're having. But yeah, if I had the money, absolutely I would do it. I think it's still incredible to me that we do this. It was only 120 years ago that we took flight for the first time, and now there are people living in space. And I would happily, I don't feel any sorry for these guys living in space that are meant to be up there for 8 days. I'd be like, great, give me some missions. What hasn't been done in space? First podcast in space. First, whatever you want to do. I'm so jealous of them.
You're having the Jägermeister on a Tuesday like that.
Yeah. Bring me the boot of booze or whatever the heck it is that is, getting stuck in space.
Well, if any loony billionaires are listening who would like the idea of, the daily from space for a week, the Monocle Daily from space,
that email address is vm@monocle.com.
Equally reachable at am@monocle.com. We have the panel here. We're ready to go. Strap us in. Mari LeConte and Vincent McAvenny, thanks for joining us. Finally, on today's show, we are back with another entry in our Letter From series, and this time it's our deputy book editor, Amy Vandenberg, about her recent trip to the island of Crete, where she is reporting for Monocle's upcoming book, The Monocle Handbook of Greece.
The sun is high and waves crash steadily against ancient stone sea walls. People mill about noisily on the cobbled pathway that winds along the coast. Many are making their way to the 16th century Rocca a Mare fortress that juts into the Gulf of Heraklion. Diners nibble on deko salata, the Cretan version of a Greek salad, and gulls call to each other overhead. I am here doing research for Monocle's latest book, The Greece Handbook, and along with notes and recordings, I am trying to absorb the atmosphere of this island. The city welcomes over 6 million tourists a year, and these are the last of them. There is a feverish and greedy mood about the city of Heraklion, and one of exhaustion too. Visitors are hungry to absorb the last of the summer sun before the return to school, the return to work, the return to some distant city or office chair. But while one would think these departures would offer their hosts a breath from the busy season, for Greeks, and certainly for Cretans, the beginning of September is a time for work. Talk to Dimitra Athanasaki, who might just be the friendliest shop owner in Heraklion. She owns a clothing and jewelry shop on a side street in the old city and makes many of the dresses she sells. Wearing a bright smile and a chunky pair of earrings and statement necklace, she welcomes each shopper with an eager yes. But autumn is a time for Dimitra to replenish her stock, and she is already designing new dresses for the spring season that she will sew over winter. A short drive through winding hills, half-baked by the hot summer sun, brings you to a network of vineyards. The rows of green against brown shades the growing grapes ready to be harvested. On a mountainside high above the Cretan village of Melembes are the personal vines of Iliana Melehin. She owns a winery of the same name in town and chose the area for its uniqueness. Wearing a white-brimmed hat and pink t-shirt, she tells me about the Rethymno region. She says it is unique for wine growing thanks to a combination of altitude and soil chemistry. The vineyards here reach 800 meters, and on the other side is a Mediterranean Sea. She says the ocean breeze impacts the taste, helping the grapes retain acidity. The harvest has come early this year, and the winery and hills are flooded with friends and producers. They are picking grapes, stacking crates, and navigating the switchbacks in loaded-up pickup trucks. The sound of cicadas rings in our ears. Across the island, the larger town of Rethymno is also taking advantage of the end of the tourist season. In a workshop on the edge of town, the Stegakis family has been making traditional instruments for 3 generations, specializing in the Cretan lira. This 3-stringed bow instrument is made from old wood from houses in the area, some beams dating back to 200 years. With many of the tourists petering away, Manolis Stegakis Jr. will be found in the back of the shop, whipping up more instruments. After so many years and with the knowledge of his father and grandfather, this takes him about a week per instrument. Clad in a work apron and black hoodie, he takes a lira down from the wall where it was on display and plays it. The high whir of the lira resonates against the stone walls, a wistful and energetic closing melody to the end of another summer in Crete.
And that was Monocle's Amy Vandenberg, and keep your eye out for the Monocle Handbook of Greece, which is set for release early next year. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Mari Leconte and Vincent McAvaney. Today's show was produced by Anita Riotta and researched by Gunnar Grunlid and Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
"2024 is a pivotal year for global politics. Meanwhile, conflict, climate change, and AI dominate the headlines. What do these global stories mean for you? The Financial Times offers fearless thinking in defining moments. Its trusted journalists deliver impartial analysis on the world's biggest news events, helping you to form your own bold opinions. Start reading the Financial Times at ft.com.